A todos, bienvenidos. Estamos en un nuevo encuentro del seminario virtual de la red de Claxo de posgrados sobre movilización del conocimiento de las ciencias sociales y humanidades en América Latina. Y hoy tenemos el placer de conversar con la profesora Sheila Slaughter. Ella es profesora titular de la Universidad de Georgia, es una pionera en el estudio de la mercantilización y privatización de la educación, del conocimiento. Hace muchísimos años que viene desarrollando estas ideas y puntualmente hace ya más de 20 años que propuso el concepto de capitalismo académico, pero no solo eso, sino que sus investigaciones trabajan y abarcan una multiplicidad de temas, tratando de dar con los distintos mecanismos en los cuales se va desarrollando de manera concreta el capitalismo académico, desde análisis sobre la propiedad intelectual, las políticas científicas y educativas, la comercialización de la ciencia y la tecnología, la mercantilización de la educación superior, quiénes son los responsables al interior de las universidades de tomar las decisiones, así como la influencia no solo de actores privados, sino de organismos no gubernamentales en las decisiones y las orientaciones de las universidades. Es autora de muchísimos libros y revistas de trabajos en investigación, tanto de capítulos como en trabajos científicos, y además ha sido presidenta de la Association for the Study of Higher Education y consultora de la National Science Foundation, entre muchas otras cosas que ha hecho. Vamos a hacer esta conversación en inglés, así que ahora le voy a agradecer por estar con nosotros y esperamos que puedan sacar muchas discusiones interesantes de esta charla. So thank you very much, Sheila. I was just introducing yourself and the course and welcoming all the students that will listen to this conversation. I want to thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure for us to have you talking about these topics.
Thank you for asking me, and I'm very happy to be here.
All right, thanks again. So I just want to jump with a first very broad question and then see where that leads us. And you can expect, I'm pretty sure, this question, because probably you've been asked quite a lot about this. But basically, how would you describe academic capitalism in a few words? And also, I'm interested in knowing if you what are the mechanisms or the specific changes that you've seen throughout this 20 or more years that remain, and which of them are new or have changed concerning the relations between knowledge and power in higher education?
Okay, that's like a big question. So the basic idea of academic capitalism is that universities have moved toward the market, indeed have been incorporated in the market to a considerable degree, whereas at one time they were either primarily state institutions, as is the case in most of the world, or they were non-profit, we call them non-profit NGOs, whatever you want to call them, but again, not part of the market. In any formal way. Tuition was low, amenities were not many, and it was students organizing themselves and working with professors, and it was a sort of simpler situation than it is over time. And what happened was that when you had the conservative turn that began with the Reagan administration, the idea came not to treat just universities, but many institutions that were not regarded as part of the market as part of the market. And universities were particularly important because in many ways they fostered the coevolution of many institutions, multiple institutions, with this more conservative turn. A really good example of this is the Law and Economics, which is a conservative movement in the United States, which was started in law schools. And funded by outside people, outside foundations. The people who gave money were often trustees of these private universities like Cornell and Harvard, and public universities like George Mason. It goes on and on. But they put in hundreds of millions of dollars to say that the basic idea was that you couldn't make a legal decision unless you considered its economic impact. Okay, and these are the guys who are sitting on our Supreme Court now. I think all of the George Bush, the other one, the younger one, and Trump's appointees are products of elite graduate schools and then, various judicial careers, but ones that were part of this law and economics movement. And then we see it with science and the development of intellectual property. Universities in the United States always owned faculties of intellectual property. That was decided in the 50s and 60s, but there wasn't much, right? And so then, or it was not like it is now. And then in the 1980s, that changed with Bayh-Dole. Yeah. I can remember going to a conference in Brussels at that time, and I said, "No, universities own it too, and they can exploit it and develop it as they will." And nobody would believe me because it had just happened. They said, "No, you can't do that." These other professors in Europe. And I said, "Yeah, it's all changed." So so then intellectual property became very important, and basically. What has happened, the big changes I see over time, okay, the most important changes, the most overwhelming changes, is that all knowledge is politicized and all knowledge is marketable now. And that is what has come from the beginning of academic capitalism going forward slowly. So over the years, and it's a very, very problematic situation. I don't see a lot of people researching it and in those terms, okay? But that's where I see it is. I see that as the big change from being, for a long time, there was space in state universities and in private universities in this country where you didn't have to do that, but there's none now. There really isn't space anymore. I mean, they've closed departments that are critical of what's going on, well, there are no jobs for people in such departments, which is, that's the excuse, right? You can't have cultural studies. How will we get jobs for these people? And so on and so forth. So, that's like the overwhelming, and then there is, you can do more and more about how all of this happened, but that's the net result. That's the big change. All money is politicized and all knowledge is marketized.
Of course, and it leads to an imbalance between disciplines, also between researchers and between universities. So if we already had before a very diverse, heterogeneous higher education system, it's becoming more and more polarized, and the consequences also for students attending will be greater. The future path of these students will be completely different if they manage to get to Harvard now more than ever, if it was always the case, because it's super clear that all the interest, the political and also the economic interest. I was struck, probably you also read about this, about the news in the UK, the complicated situation they are in because they became so dependent on especially Chinese students, right, that now after COVID, they don't know what to do. And that not only deals with training students and the future of the different degrees, but also research, because there, and unlike the US probably, even though they do have a lot of private funding, the public funding is related to the money that the university gets. So even if they do have public funding, it's incredible that this year many universities, for instance, will not be having PhD positions, because they cannot afford them, because they will not have the Chinese students paying the fees for the undergraduate or masters.
Well, that's happening in the US, of course, and and it's willfully so, because the Korean administration, Trump, just doesn't want these people, okay? And it's like, I'm sure he does not know that for the last 40 years, maybe more, but at least the last 40 years, the majority of PhD students and postdocs have been foreign nationals in science. And the reason is because we don't pay scientists as well as we pay attorneys and physicians and business persons and so on and so forth in the US. So people are often enamored of those things but then change their mind when they figure out. I mean, it's not that they have a bad life at all. It's just that the other ones make a lot, especially at those elite places, can make a lot more. I mean, there's some, of course, star scientists who make a lot, but generally it's not that wonderful. And, you know, it's only a very small part of the top that makes a lot of money. So I don't know what will happen. I mean, who is going to be in the labs, if anything? And the states in the United States, the several states with great public universities, the states have no money. I mean, they're cutting positions right, left, and center because they have no tax revenue. And that is what has been funding public universities. Now, the very elite ones, you know, like the flagship universities, all right, 50 states, there's 50 flagship universities. So if we take the University of Alaska, for example, or the University of Arizona, they have been cut since the recession. They're like you know, like, well, Alaska did it just right now, but I mean, they cut the university like 50%. I mean, what will happen? I don't know.
Also, no, definitely. I mean, it's very interesting also to think about academic capitalism, not only as how the university becomes part of the market and becomes a capitalist actor, a fully capitalist actor, but also the responsibility of the state, how the state is pushing the universities towards this dead end. Because
yeah, they have tremendously pushed them in that direction, you know, but well, they've pushed them in that direction, and they pushed foreign students and all that sort of stuff because then they could do more and pay less. And now it's not good. It's not clear what will happen. Now, you know, overall, the universities with the big endowments will do all right because they have so much money. I mean, Harvard has more money than many small countries, probably more money than the whole state of California. And the 5 biggest ones with the biggest endowments are you know, Harvard is a case of its own, but then the others are really, really.
On the case of the endowments, I think it's worthwhile to speak a little bit more about it, because in Latin America, it's something that it's still super foreign to us, because here most of the universities, the most prestigious ones, remain public universities, and these public universities,
private endowment.
No, not as in the US. What they do have is the possibility to get their own funding, and that can be either through selling like small tuition and fees, sometimes for postgraduate courses, or for, I don't know, English courses even are paid courses, as well as private sponsorship of research or agreements with private firms for consultancies, technical assistances. But this form of endowment, which is a fund owned by the university, and that is also financialized, as it is in the case of Harvard, it's something that we don't have for good in Latin America. We have a lot of things that are not good at all, that are worse in Latin America than in the US or Europe, but we don't have endowments in the universities.
Endowments can be used for good and bad, okay? But I'll tell you what I think. Okay, so here, I'll tell you about it. Thomas Piketty has a whole chapter on endowments in his first book, you know, the one we all first read, because he regards them as like a perfect example of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So universities, because they were able to, we call them nonprofits. They were able, and they're somewhat actually different than NGOs, but I'm not going to go into that because lots of, well, so anyway, they were able to be governed by people appointed to a board, all right? Like, you know, like Harvard and Yale and Columbia, they would all have been church related to begin with. And here they were in this colony, and there was sort of no one to tell them what to do. So they had these boards. And then who helped with, you know, they were ultimately responsible for the university, although the university also had a president and faculty and then students. And then over time, there were court cases that said these boards could appoint future board members in perpetuity and run the university the way they wanted to. That was decided by the 1850s or 60s, unless there was gross malfeasance. And so one of the things people started to do was say, well, we should have, these people want to give us money and we should accept it. And we should use that money for education and for making our universities better. But we should also invest it and try to make more money for it. And when you first really start to get endowments that mattered in the United States was around the turn of the century, when the robber barons started giving money. Like the guy who does Johns Hopkins was a railroad baron. University of Chicago is Rockefeller. Harvard is the banking industry from the East Coast at that time. And University of Minnesota is the grain mill guys, right? You know, those big fortunes. And they all, and then public universities said, well, we should be able to have endowments too, in addition to these private guys. And they did, but they were usually much smaller, although that changed by the sort of the 80s and 90s. There are some public universities with significant endowments now. So then time goes by, endowments get bigger and bigger, and then all the endowments become highly financialized because the trustees of these universities, in many cases, although not always, actually manage the money themselves. And these are people who, you know, are at the top of business echelons and networks, and they are able to figure out where to invest the money. And some of them have rates of return that are like 16, 18% higher than Warren Buffett and stuff like that. So there's also extreme conflict of interest. They invest in their own stuff. It's very hard to police and all of that.
And now it's no longer used to put first the priorities of the university, but actually, as far as I know, the percentage they use every year is related. It's like the same amount of money. Or, yeah, it doesn't matter if that year the university has, I don't know, thriving projects that deserve to be funded and they didn't get enough funding from the National Science Foundation or any other funding agency. So the university has the money to decide to fund that, but still will not do it because the mechanism is just like, okay, we use this 4% every year and then we keep expanding this amount of money we have.
That's what they have done. But in recent years, it's become more complex. So they have to spend their 4%, but they also have multiple partnerships with other nonprofits. Okay, so Harvard didn't have a business school until the late 1990s or early 2000s, because that was too tacky for Harvard to have. But now they do, because we can no longer have universities without business schools, clearly, in the mindset of the people that run them. And they did that through donations to like a specific thing, okay? So within the university, you can name where your gifts goes and what happens to it. Entities and universities within universities can also borrow based on the endowment of their whatever, independently of the university as a whole. And then if you look at the debt load of public universities, like the University of California, you want to say, what? I mean, it could go under, you know, and things like that. And actually, the one department at the University of California in the, I think this was the late 90s or the early 2000s again, actually auctions its biotech department. The department did it themselves to a European biotech corporation. And, you know, things like this go, they have incredible freedom, which Europe has now too, to buy, sell, make, and do things, not as much as the United States. As like independent actors, sometimes schools within, sometimes the university as a whole. So those are like radically new developments. And then by using the connections to the private sector and the state, because universities can put their money, the ones with big endowments, anywhere they want. They can act as arm of the state, even if they're a public university, or a nonprofit, or a capitalist organization. So MIT didn't have a medical school. Medical schools are really, really expensive. And people in Boston, the elites of Boston, many of them who were trustees of these universities, all the actors were, put together the three, the Broad Institute, the Whitehead Institute, and that links to all the hospitals in Massachusetts, which are publicly funded. And now MIT works through them, not having to have a medical school, does all its training in the public universities, right? Arms of the state, not paying for it.
And still charges the students that
of course it charges the students. And then, although, you know, these, like MIT only has like a class of 1,500 undergraduate schools. These are graduate schools. They really don't have a lot of undergraduates. Harvard doesn't either, compared to like big public universities. They're too expensive. And then,
of course, and they and the business actually is not undergraduate education.
Yeah,
I mean, it's research,
postgraduate. Selection is what it's about at the undergraduate level. But so it's all these complicated things that have happened, and it's incredibly hard to figure it out. And generally, the way people feel about it is that they do good. They do, you know. So like a Harvard graduate, MD, well, this is actually an MIT guy, who, he starts a venture capital thing where he invests in the university's biotech thing, you know, stuff. And they make discoveries that are in fact useful and could create new wonderful things and all of that. Everybody's making lots of money, and they're going on to endow other things within it. And the idea is it will all trickle down, but it really doesn't. But you can't say they're doing terrible things. What you have to say is it just doesn't actually often get to the regular people without costing $800 a shot a month for the pill or something.
Also, no, and also the fact that these are few very elite universities that also have the bargaining capacity or power, the enforcement capacity to negotiate with big corporations. Also, they are part of that network in a way. But most of the universities, and this we see it here in Argentina, we see it in most of the Latin American countries, when there is a multinational firm, for instance, that aims to do research with you, actually, the reality of that agreement will be that the corporation will keep all the knowledge, will keep the rights to patent, or even if you share the patent, it will be only the corporation which will profit from that, whereas the university will just keep the property of the patent without any concrete benefit, and even in some cases with the researchers being limited in terms of publishing research results. And this, to say the least, because of course there is also the case of ideas being stolen directly by the firms and so on and so forth. I remember an interview with a researcher from the University of Buenos Aires, where I was asking him about a patent that is co-owned with Columbia University, and he was saying, yeah, you know why that patent exists? because Colombia pays for the fees, because Colombia has also the judges in the courts that will then assure that if a corporation is trying to use the patent without paying the royalties, without licensing it, then it will be punished. And they do have the enforcement capacity to do it. Of course, we cannot. So I guess it's also a matter of the differences between few universities that are playing a game that it's no longer similar to that ideal we had and the imaginary of what universities were supposed to be,
right.
and all the other universities looking at them and saying, okay, we need to be like them, like the effect of the world rankings also. Everybody looking at Harvard and trying to imagine what can we do to look a little bit more like Harvard, and that also affects all the other universities that are not in this wheel a lot.
Right. And you know, not only will most universities, I mean, how could you catch up, right? And unless somebody took all their stuff away. But I think it's a bad thing to do it, to try to be like them. I mean, I think it's a much better thing. I mean, I keep thinking, why don't, there's so many people with PhDs, so many young people, right? We overproduce, and in all the fields, in science and in business, and the other thing that's really important, it isn't just science that's the money, it's how the laws run for it and all of that, which the business schools, the law schools, they all have a big part to play in that, and you know, contribute to it, and people just don't look at that, but that's
yeah, exactly. We tend to focus too much on everything that is related to pharma or sciences in general.
Yeah, and all this other stuff is you know, just tying you up, and stuff like that, and making them more impossible to change, because it's becomes law or administrative law, or nobody looks at administrative law. That's amazingly important in all of these things. Everybody should be looking at this. But so there, why aren't young people starting universities themselves? I mean, you know, they could get together. They could probably get funding for it one way or the other. There are some left corporations out there, but there's also public funding, and you would have to do something that would say, we're going to do a university where we're going to have incredibly high quality education, and we're going to select people, and they would do their criteria. They would have to be able to do work, but nothing else would matter other than demonstrating that. And then they could
I guess also it's the fact that the funding, you need to apply for it, and and the competitive mechanisms reinforce somehow a cycle where the winners are always, like what we were saying before about Piketty's analysis, like the winners are always the same institutions. So
right.
that probably creates, first of all, for those that are never, like always losing, it creates a cycle where the budget shortfalls worsen every year. But at the same time, for those even trying to imagine an alternative or trying to think about a different solution for a new institution or for the institutions they're in, I think the spirit is easy to turn it into a pessimistic one, because the big universities are always winning the money. And it also happens, unfortunately, in the rest of the world. It's not only in the US. These competitive mechanisms that were introduced by the states actually worsen the polarization between institutions. So I guess that also plays a role.
I was just trying to raise a possible way out of it. And an institution, like if you created your own institution, you would have to say, you know, and we're going to do a different kind of medicine, and so that it would be a different way that you would try to change things. So you never know. All those things are possible. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to go back you mentioned at some point the trustees, and I know you've done a lot of work on that, and on I was telling you before we started recording, what I can call, like, being an economist, like the visible hand of the market, in the sense that we normally think of, okay, the commodification of higher education, and we think in general in abstract terms of the university becoming more like an enterprise and so on and so forth. But then that's when the analysis of how trustees work, the board of trustees works, is a very clear mechanism of the influence, the direct influence of capitalist interests in the everyday life of the university, and also in the long-term perspectives or horizon of the institutions. So I just wanted to ask a little bit on that, and on the differences you've seen by looking at different institutions. Like MIT probably is one extreme case, but then you can also see what's going on in some very elite but public institutions in this respect. So if you can, I don't know, just...
The sad thing about that, one of the things we wanted to do after we did these last studies on trustees was trustees at public universities, even elite public universities, tend to be appointed because they've supported the sitting governor who's going to appoint people politically, right? They've given them a lot of money. It's like the equivalent of an ambassadorship in the president, right? And they want to be on the board of trustees. And the trustees in public universities are not in perpetuity. They tend to be 8 to 12-year terms, so that they're always turning over with new governors doing different people. And we think this is very preliminary, and we would really have to go back and do it, that the trustees who are the universities that are most successful in terms of being high in ratings as public universities are and supporting research endeavors and so on and so forth that make them famous, and all of that are universities that tend to appoint certain kinds of donors or certain kinds of industries that are always represented on their board over many, many years, as opposed to a lot of them where they just change because of the politics. And that would call for a particular political culture in the state for that to happen, because you get if you got a Donald Trump of a governor, that's not going to happen. And they tend to be blue states, so Washington State, UW as they call it out there, and where Microsoft is, and all of that is like that. The University of California is, although that's a more complicated system because it's one board is everything, and then like there's a real difference even within the UC system. So it's Berkeley, UCLA, and the University of San Francisco Medical School that are probably the most elite, and then the other ones are okay, but they're elite, but not like, and they have their own boards, but they don't have actual authority of the state. So, but they still manage to create that culture of giving and supporting certain things by appointing trustees who give money and who create many, many opportunities and links between the universities and the computer industry, or nanotechnology or whatever, in ways that you can't do without some continuity. So we think, although we have not studied it enough to be sure, that those are the ones who are doing that the most.
So in this scenario, and especially in this world context we are in, where academic capitalism is everywhere, with its own traits, with its own features, with like, of course, in a mix between how universities worked before, but as a trend is a strong one, I think, everywhere in the world. What do you think are the the chances to counterbalance it and how we can do it. You were thinking about, okay, maybe we need to create new institutions, different institutions that can pick up from where universities are now and try to make things better. Is this the alternative? Can we do something with the institutions we do have now?
You know, the pandemic is going to be interesting. Crisis and chaos always creates opportunities. Although historically, they, in the United States, they only shift if the middle class goes with it too. And a lot of times the middle class is trying to hang on to be more like the higher ones and doesn't do it. But if they get hit too hard, there's a real opportunity for things to change. And I think a lot of people are aware of that now. And it might be a moment where it could be possible that universities would have to sort of scale back a lot of the things that they have provided that were, you know, like junior year in Europe and, you know, all these traveling things and programs. They're not, I don't know how they can afford stuff like that. And then you would focus more on what's really maybe important. I think a great thing that's happening is that the University of California has decided not to use the standardized testing for who gets in, because it's too discriminatory, and the looking at results of how people get there other ways and do just as well, that's an issue. I mean, I don't know if that would have happened without the pandemic, and the likelihood that they won't have seats that are filled and stuff like that, because that's a real likelihood. That there are two things there. It's demographic, and people are just starting not to see the payoff for going. I mean, so they're willing to go someplace else, right? And maybe they don't have to go to Berkeley. Maybe they can go to the UC system and have much less debt and end up
exactly
better than they were.
Also.
And things like that. And the debt is like a whole student debt, student tuition. It's a whole other. I mean, you know, when I went to school, I don't think it was more than $200 a semester to go to the University of Wisconsin. And that was because I was from out of state. So, I mean, it's just the degree which it's gone up is just incredible. And that's, you know, was a decision that was made. People should pay more of their costs. That was a political project of the, as I said, starting with Reagan, and, you know, Democrats kept it up. Bill Clinton didn't do anything to change it.
Yeah, well, the big priorities like tuition and fees are even in other parts of the world. We normally speak about the US, the UK, how Spain, but in Latin America, I mean, in Chile, the struggles against tuition and fees and for free higher education in the last years have been huge. And Colombia also has a system that has followed the US so much, and that includes tuition and fees, and the consequences for developing countries are as worse or even worse as they are in the US. The students that live that come from the wealthiest families end up in the best universities, which are the most expensive ones, and it's simply not true that this system will help the poorest because they will get the scholarship and so on. Yes, even if the scholarships exist, it just simply doesn't happen because those students will not even apply, and also because those scholarships end up being also linked to meritocratic systems, and these students come precisely from the schools that are in the poorest neighborhoods that struggle to teach students. So it's just like the same system as in the US, and the consequences also for the whole system, because these are debts that in most cases will not be paid. So it just increases financialization, increases the temptation to create derivatives and risky instruments to bet on the students' possibilities to repay for their education, which
It
doesn't happen, and also changes completely the view the students have on education, because it's not the same thing to go to a public university, a free university, as we have here, for instance, in Argentina. Here, every student can get access. Once it finishes high school, there's no exam, and you just appoint yourself. And the way they get involved and the commitment with the university, with education, with the public sector is completely different when you're buying a degree. I mean, of course, not this. It ends up being like that. I mean,
I can get paid. I can pay back. Is what? So I can pay it back. I can't do music. I can't do anthropology. I've got to do.
Yeah. Also. Totally. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. But it's true. It's true what you are saying. I mean, maybe to say my final word and leave it to you to close with some thoughts. I think this could be an opportunity. It's also a time where education is changing a lot, because and it's becoming crystal clear that the inequalities that we have are directly translating into education. Because I will give you just one simple example. I teach basic economics in the University of Buenos Aires, and I have 50 students enrolled. Of course, this semester we only teach online, and I teach with Zoom, but I only have between 25 and 30 students every class. So there are 20 students that are not attending, and they don't reply emails. And of course, there's always a percentage of students that enroll but then don't show up because it's for free and they're not paying. Maybe they decided they want to start, but then in the end they cannot. But never almost half of the students that were enrolled in your course. So it's also this situation that it's making so obvious that the importance of education and also the inequalities in the world. I think it should be an opportunity to change things. And once we can go back to a regular university life, make it better and change it, and also change the opportunities for research, because also the pandemic is showing how important it is to have public research systems, to have people doing research on things that may not be so beneficial in economic terms, but still are of utmost importance for society.
Right. But one, the overwhelming example of that in the United States is public health. You used to be able to get a degree in public health in many places. They have just gutted. Public health has been gutted in the many states and private universities over the past 20, 30 years. And now all of a sudden, everybody's saying, what about public health? And public health was what gave us clean water and sewer systems and, all those sorts of things. And now we don't have that infrastructure anymore, which is why in the United States, we don't have tests, can't do contact tracing, can't do any of those things. So I completely agree with you on that. And I guess, another way to think about it, if you wanted to really push what universities could do, it would be to probably work with public administrations to in the several states and all of that, and the federal government to rebuild infrastructure and also create programs for people like in the WA who are out of work, WPA and all of that who are out of work. But it's impossible in the political climate we have right now in the United States. I mean, people are thinking about all this, but
well,
we have to study social media much more, and on like that for not for how we all monetize it and make ads and all of that, but how you can actually realize that is a promise. So there's so much we could do, and universities could be key, and we should do everything in our power to make it happen.
I agree. I completely agree. Thank you very much for your time, Sheila. Again, it was a pleasure for me to talk to you.
It is always a pleasure to talk to you. From the first
Oh.
moment I met you, I felt that way.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks all of you that will be listening to this conversation. I hope.
Email me if they want to about anything. You have my email address.
Yes,
Just
I
say
do.
you're part of the conversation, so I open the email. Okay.
Good.
Say
Good.
associated with Cecilia or something like that.
Okay, I will tell them to write on behalf of me.
Okay. Just
and
because
I'm pretty sure.
we don't open everything unless, yeah.
Yes, indeed. It's great. Well, thank you very much again.
All right. Bye.